Okay, let's unpack this. Homer. We're not just talking about the author of some old books.
No.
I mean, we're talking about the foundational author of Western literature, the supposed genius whose works have shaped, well, everything, philosophy, education, art, for nearly 3,000 years. Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Today, we are wrestling with what is probably the most enduring literary identity crisis in history.
That's a good way to put it.
We're moving well beyond a simple summary of the Iliad and the Odyssey to really tackle what scholars call the Homeric Question.
Which is this complex, centuries-long debate.
Exactly. A debate about who this man was, if he was a man at all, and crucially, how his poems actually came to be written down and preserved.
Right. So our mission today is to take this huge, fragmented academic puzzle and really distill the consensus and the controversy for you.
Oh.
Homer is one of the most influential figures we can name.
Oh, easily.
Plato himself called him the one who has taught Greece. And centuries later, you have the great Roman poet Virgil, who, I mean, he built his entire career on Homer's foundation. He referred to him simply as poet sovereign.
Yet, and here is the central paradox, and this is why we're deep diving today.
Yes.
This author, praised so universally, whose work is absolutely foundational to our cultural identity, is, in the view of modern scholarship, largely a fictionalized figure.
It's incredible.
His identity is contested, his birthplace is debated across, half a dozen cities.
At least.
And the very method of composition, that moment he went from song to text, was completely revolutionized by 20th century research.
We're pulling today from some dense sources. We've got scholarly analyses covering biographical traditions, the evolution of academic criticism from antiquity right up to the latest contemporary debates on linguistic dating, and the stunning findings of oral-formulaic research.
So we're going to try and figure out not just what Homer wrote, but how this incredible piece of literary engineering came to exist.
And why the question of who he was still sparks such furious arguments today.
Let's start, as any good tradition must, with the monuments themselves.
The poems.
Because their scale and their influence are the primary reasons why this whole mystery matters so profoundly.
So we begin with the two works universally attributed to the man known as Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey. Most people know the general outline, but let's really nail down the core emotional and thematic focus of each narrative.
Because they are, as you said, vastly different experiences.
They really are.
The Iliad is, it's intensely focused. It takes place over only a few weeks during the final year of the decade-long Trojan War.
And geographically, we're pretty much stuck in one place.
Right. We are fixed mostly around the walls of Troy and the Achaean camp. Its central theme is menace, or rage.
Specifically, the rage of Achilles.
The fatal quarrel between the supreme commander, King Agamemnon, and the greatest warrior, Achilles. It is a profound, bloody study in the destructive nature of pride, honor, and, of course, grief.
It is so monumental in its seriousness, and that you turn to the Odyssey, and the entire narrative structure it flips completely. It's an epic of travel, of persistence, and cleverness.
Precisely. The Odyssey picks up after Troy has fallen and chronicles the 10-year journey of Odysseus, king of Ithaca, as he struggles desperately to return home.
And everything is thrown at him.
Everything. He's punished by the gods, detained by sorceresses and nymphs. He faces monsters. It depicts man's struggle and perseverance using wit and cunning menace instead of the pure force we see in the Iliad.
So the theme is completely different. It's about return, restoration, overcoming all this divine interference.
Yes. And what immediately alerts scholars to the complexity of their origin is the language itself.
Homeric Greek, or Epic Greek. You mentioned earlier this is not a language people just spoke on the street.
No, not at all. It's a literary Kunstsprach.
An artificial language.
That's right, an artificial language. It's a purposeful blend of linguistic features taken from different centuries and different geographic regions. Primarily the Eastern Ionic dialect, but you also see features of the Aeolic dialect mixed in.
And why is that blend so significant?
Because it essentially proves the poems were inherited over generations. No single person speaking in a single place at a single time could have naturally invented this linguistic cocktail.
I see. So it's the product of an evolving poetic tradition.
Which makes the idea of a singular one-time author almost impossible.
So the language itself is a composite artifact that tells us we're dealing with a deep historical process, not just a sudden flash of genius from one person.
Exactly. And, despite the deeply tragic, serious, and monumental themes, our sources remind us that the poems contain the full spectrum of human experience.
There's humor in there.
Yes, there are moments of high comedy and laughter, often involving the gods, which gives the audience a moment of relief from the constant threat of death and divine wrath.
It's this emotional and structural depth that really cemented their immense legacy. It's almost impossible to overstate the cultural impact these two works had.
They weren't just popular entertainment, not by a long shot. They were the absolute core of ancient Greek culture and education.
They were the curriculum.
They were famously the first literary works taught to every single student. If you wanted to teach a child what it meant to be Greek, you taught them Homer.
They fostered the foundational ideals. Concepts like kleos,
Undying glory gained through heroic action.
Antigua.
The honor or value accorded to a man in society.
All of these were defined by the behavior of Achilles, Hector, and Odysseus. They were the moral compass, the historical memory, and the literary textbook, all rolled into one scroll.
And that influence is literally unbroken. You mentioned Virgil.
Yes.
Dante referred to Homer as the master of all masters. Virgil built the Aeneid as a conscious Roman response and successor to the Greek epics.
And today?
If you look at literature, music, or film today, the patterns of the quest, the journey home, the internal struggle with rage, they are all traceable directly back to these two poems.
Even in modern translations, right, like the critically acclaimed work by Emily Wilson, we are still wrestling with the absolute weight and relevance of these stories.
We are.
So this magnitude of influence means that the question of who actually composed them isn't some obscure academic inquiry.
No, it's fundamental.
It's fundamental to understanding the origins of Western identity. And, given that profound significance, you would expect a library full of reliable biographies. Instead,
we have the opposite.
the complete opposite.
That's the irony, isn't it? For the world's most influential poet, we know essentially nothing certain about him.
Which brings us to the central insight of modern scholarship. The ancient conception of a single historical biographical author named Homer is it's likely a sophisticated fictional narrative.
Yes. His anonymity, coupled with the desire to celebrate the works, led to the increasing mythologization of his life.
We can actually track this myth-making through the various biographical traditions that just proliferated across the Greek world.
The most widespread one, the one that everyone pictures, portrays Homer as a blind bard.
Right, a figure of reverence whose physical impairment suggests an internal, deeper vision.
And he's typically placed in Ionia, which is the central coastal region of Anatolia.
But the moment you try to pin down any specific fact, the whole narrative just dissolves into contradiction.
It does.
The debate over his birthplace is probably the most famous example. It became a point of civic pride for cities all across the Greek world.
7 different cities claimed him. Pindar, a 5th century BC poet, credits Chios and Smyrna.
But then you also have claims from Argos, Pylos, Colophon, or Athens.
Right, and our sources emphasize that no single account ever achieved mainstream acceptance. This lack of agreement isn't a sign that historians just lost the records.
No, it's a sign that the records were never reliable in the first place.
It's proof that people were retroactively applying a biography to an anonymous masterpiece.
And the more you look at the details, the more purely fictional they seem. The accounts of his parentage, for example. They're just wildly varied.
Oh, they strain credulity entirely. The biographical accounts, which were compiled much later, needed to ensure Homer had a suitably divine or heroic pedigree.
Of course.
So he's sometimes claimed to be descended from one of the muses, or from the god Apollo, or from mythological figures like Orpheus.
But there's one that's even more spectacular than that.
Yes, the one found in some traditions dating back to Roman imperial times. It claimed his parents were Epicas, the daughter of Nestor, and Telemachus, the son of Odysseus.
Wait, so the man who sings the story of Odysseus' journey home is, in this version, the grandson of the hero,
Yes.
uniting the poet and the heroic subject lineally.
Precisely. It's the ultimate act of myth-making. It elevates the poet to the same status as the figures he chronicles, making him a character in his own epic history.
It's the Greeks essentially deciding that the poet must be as great as his poetry.
That's a perfect way to put it. And then we get the strange, almost low-stakes anecdotes that contrast so sharply with the monumental subject matter.
Yes, alongside the high-flown genealogy, we have these small, grounded legends.
The tradition that he died on the island of Ios is perhaps the most common location for his death. But the most bizarre story is the riddle he supposedly failed to solve.
Ah, the fisherman's riddle. Remind us of the details.
The legend says Homer encountered some fishermen and failed to answer their riddle, which led to his death from shame or despair.
And the riddle was?
The riddle was, We left whatever we caught and carry whatever we didn't. The answer, which the blind bard supposedly couldn't figure out, was lice.
Lice. The man who crafted the rage of Achilles is defeated by the common, messy reality of tiny human parasites.
The contrast is extraordinary, isn't it?
It grounds him in the world of rhapsodes, these traveling performers, who would face all kinds of petty humiliation and common concerns.
And that contrasts so sharply with the divine parentage claims.
Right, this huge yawning gap between the mythical, demigod-like figure and the obscure, possibly impoverished traveling rhapsode is what modern scholarship has spent 2 centuries dissecting.
And this centrality of the figure meant that Homer's name became a magnet for every work of perceived literary excellence.
Which brings us to the catalog of works we call the Homerica.
Works attributed to Homer in antiquity, but definitively rejected today.
And they demonstrate that Homer was more than a man, he was a literary brand name.
The list is extensive. It shows how much the Greeks wanted to credit him with. Besides the 2 main epics, many people in antiquity attributed the Homeric hymns to him.
Which are beautiful, sophisticated invocations to the gods.
Absolutely. And then there's the contest of Homer and Hesiod, which details a fictional poetic competition.
And the more popular epics, known collectively as the epic cycle, which filled in the gaps around the Iliad, like the Cypria and the Little Iliad.
Exactly. And my favorite example of the brand name is that comic mini-epic, the Batrachomyomachia.
The Frog-Mouse War.
The Frog-Mouse War. It's a parody, a miniature epic that describes a mock heroic battle between frogs and mice, all cast in the monumental language of the Iliad.
The fact that the Greeks decided the poet who wrote the definition of glory also wrote a high-style parody about vermin tells you everything.
It tells you that Homer was simply the designation for best-in-class epic poetry.
And this whole historical process, the total collapse of the biography coupled with the massive scale and influence of the poems, it forced scholars to shift focus entirely.
Right. They realized they would never find the man, so they had to look for the author in the text.
And that crucial shift ushers in the Homeric question.
The Homeric question isn't just one debate, it's a centuries-long academic war over composition, transmission, and unity.
It's the quest to understand how these poems came into our possession.
And when criticism first started, the question wasn't who wrote Homer, but what Homer wrote.
Right. The earliest preserved critiques, dating back to the 7th century BC, were deeply moral. They focused on Homer's controversial treatment of the gods,
who in the Iliad are often petty, adulterous, deceptive, and violent.
Critics like the poet Xenophanes of Colophon famously denounced this portrayal as immoral. He argued that the gods should be depicted as paragons of virtue, not flawed humans.
And this created an immediate theological crisis for a society that revered the poems as foundational texts.
Which led almost immediately to the defense of Homer. And this set the stage for over 1,000 years of interpretation.
Right. This defense came from the allegorists, like the Aeneas of Rhegium. They argued the poems weren't meant to be taken literally.
So the battles of the gods were really allegories for battles between cosmic forces or moral concepts.
Exactly. The Aeneas famously proposed that the war between Achilles and Hector was an allegory for the battle between the dry and the wet elements.
Wow.
And that allowed the poems to survive religious critique, positioning them as complex repositories of hidden wisdom, not just narrative history.
This allegorical reading then cemented their place in education.
Absolutely. The Iliad and Odyssey became staple school texts throughout the Hellenistic and Roman periods, which led to the necessary creation of these massive scholarly commentaries to explain the historical, cultural, and linguistic difficulties to students who lived centuries later.
The Stoic philosophers really ran with this, didn't they? They widely regarded the poems as allegories conveying their own ethical and philosophical doctrines.
They did, and this completely transformed Homer's image from a simple bard into a prototypical, almost divine philosopher.
And this monumental approach to interpreting and preserving Homer, it peaked during the Byzantine era.
Particularly with the scholars of the 12th century. And you have to understand, this wasn't just casual book collecting. This was a profound act of intellectual preservation that saved the works for the West.
Give us a sense of the scale of this work, especially with Eustathius of Thessalonica.
Eustathius's commentary is just breathtaking in its physical magnitude. Our sources detail that his commentary on the Iliad alone sprawls over nearly 4,000 oversized pages in modern printed editions.
4,000 pages on just the Iliad.
Just the Iliad. His Odyssey commentary adds almost 2,000 more. This scale demonstrates the monumental effort required to stabilize, explain, and defend the text against medieval critics and the shifting cultural landscape.
So that work ensured that the tradition survived intact until the Renaissance.
So Homer survives for 2,000 years as the revered, wise, and singular poet. Then, in the modern era, that reverence collapses into radical skepticism, and the questions start getting harsh.
Starting with a scathing attack in the 17th century.
Right. The attack came in 1664 from François Hedelin, the Abbé d'Aubignac. He was an extreme outlier at the time, but he launched a critique that would prove to be, well, very prescient.
He argued the poems were incoherent, immoral, and entirely without the structural genius later critics claimed.
And his conclusion was radical. Homer never existed.
Just flat out didn't exist.
And the epics were merely a disorganized pile of shorter songs, hastily cobbled together by incompetent editors who lacked artistic vision.
So that was the first major shot fired in the Homeric question.
And the attack was refined about 50 years later by the English scholar Richard Bentley. Bentley was slightly more forgiving. He agreed a poet named Homer probably existed, but he was an obscure oral poet.
He said he wrote a sequel of songs and rhapsodies to be sung by himself for small earnings and good cheer at festivals.
That's a key distinction there. Bentley saw them as a sequel of songs, suggesting they were intended to be performed sequentially, but not necessarily edited into a cohesive, massive epic until much, much later.
So he's separating the singer from the editor.
Exactly. Bentley suggested they weren't collected and unified into the epic form we recognize until the time of Pisistratus, the Athenian tyrant, some 500 years after they were first sung.
So the idea that the text we read is the result of later assembly, not original composition, was now firmly established.
And this leads us to the formalization of the entire debate driven by Friedrich August Wolff in 1795. This is the moment the analyst school was born.
Wolff's Prolegomena ad Homerem.
It formalized the debate with a powerful, comprehensive argument. His core claim was that the material began as short, separate oral songs, possibly composed as early as the 10th century BC.
And what was his proof?
He pointed to the structural anomalies, the mixed dialects, and the repetitive elements as proof of their composite origin.
We talked about the mixed dialect, the Kunstsprech. Why did that lead him to this conclusion?
Because for Wolff, the mixture of Ionic and Aeolic and the presence of archaic forms alongside later language proved that the material had been inherited and modified over hundreds of years by successive bards in different regions.
So it's like linguistic archaeology.
It is. He concluded that the material passed through oral tradition for 4 centuries before being assembled into prototypical written versions in the 6th century BC by literate authors. And, crucially, he argued these texts were then extensively edited and shaped into their present state.
So, Wolff's theory created the entire academic struggle of the 19th century. Everyone trying to recover the original, authentic, shorter poems that were hidden beneath the excrescences or later additions made by editors.
And the analysts split into 2 dominant sub-theories over how the assembly occurred. First, we had the lay theory,
which treated the epics like a patchwork quilt.
Right. The lay theorists argued the poems were simply built from a huge number of short, independent, and often unrelated songs, or lays. They focused on identifying the seams and inconsistencies in the narrative where these separate songs were crudely joined together.
Okay, and the other theory?
And then you had the more moderate position, the nucleus theory,
which suggested that Homer did compose a shorter primary version of the Iliad and Odyssey.
A core nucleus, yes.
Which subsequent poets then expanded, interpolated, and revised substantially over time, adding episodes and speeches to bulk it up to its current size.
Right, but both camps, the lay theorists and the nucleus theorists, fundamentally rejected the Unitarian view.
The idea that these were the works of a single, inspired genius composing one cohesive narrative.
Exactly. So for over a century, the debate raged. Was it one genius or a series of clumsy editors stitching fragments together?
But the Unitarians, those who argued for superior artistic unity, they never fully gave up, and they were finally vindicated, in a way, by a paradigm shift in the 20th century.
The true breakthrough came after World War I, when scholarship moved out of the library and into the field.
Right. This was the pivotal work of Milman, Parry, and later his student Albert Lord.
And this is the foundation of the Oral-Formulaic Theory. They went to study living traditions, specifically folk bards in the Balkans, in what was then Yugoslavia.
Why was that fieldwork so crucial?
It was crucial because they needed to understand composition without literacy. They observed bards composing massive, thousands of line epics entirely from memory, improvising them anew at every single performance.
Which provided the crucial parallel for Homer.
It did. Parry and Lord concluded that the Homeric poems were composed through the same process, improvised oral performance.
And this theory was so widely accepted because it immediately explained those puzzling features that the analysts had used to argue for fragmentation.
The massive redundancy, the stock epithets, the repetitive phrases.
Right. The analysts saw those as signs of bad, lazy composition.
But the Oral-Formulaic Theory proved they weren't lazy. They were essential tools for an extemporizing bard.
Of course.
If you are composing 15,000 lines on the fly, you don't have time to invent a new phrase every time the sun rises or a warrior speaks. You need a set phrase that fits the dactylic hexameter meter instantly.
Swift-footed Achilles, rosy-fingered Dawn, gray-eyed Athena.
Those formulas are the building blocks of rapid, high-quality improvisation.
So Parry and Lord explained the how the mechanics of composition, but the who and when remained fuzzy. And that led to the most recent school of thought, neo-analysis.
Neo-analysis attempts to reconcile the Unitarian emphasis on artistic unity with the analyst's recognition of traditional inherited elements.
So they're trying to bridge the gap.
They are. They accept that the final poems are unified, but they seek to trace the relationship between the surviving works and the lost poems of the wider epic cycle.
And their method is fascinating because they use structural flaws and anomalies in the text as historical evidence.
That's the critical insight. Instead of discarding the anomalies as later editorial mistakes, the neo-analysts use them to reconstruct knowledge of earlier versions of the myths that the bards were working with.
So the mistakes are clues.
They argue that these strange gaps or contradictions are residual signs of the older, inherited tradition fighting against the final poet's desire for a unified narrative.
Give us a specific example of an anomaly they point to in the text.
Okay, in the Iliad, they look at Ajax, the second greatest Achaean warrior. His role in the main poem is oddly diminished compared to his prominence in earlier myths. Or consider the scene of the embassy sent to Achilles to beg him to rejoin the fight. Neo-analysts find evidence suggesting that in earlier versions, different characters compose that embassy.
And in the Odyssey, what are the anomalies there?
We see indications that Penelope, Odysseus's wife, may have recognized him much earlier in the narrative and even conspired with him against the suitors.
Which would contradict the famous scene where she tests him at the very end.
It would. These are moments where the massive shifting tradition poked through the carefully constructed final version.
So after all this analysis, centuries of argument and field work, what is the modern consensus regarding the identity and origin of the poems? What can we say for sure?
Well, we have several key contemporary agreements. First and foremost, based on detailed linguistic analysis, differences in narrative manner, theology, ethics, vocabulary, and geographical perspective.
Yeah.
Most scholars agree that while the poems are internally unified, the Iliad and the Odyssey were not produced by the same primary author.
So we have two geniuses composing in the same tradition, perhaps separated by a generation or two, but not one blind bard.
Not Homer, but Homers.
A collective genius, maybe.
A collective genius, if you like.
Yeah.
The second agreement is almost universal. The Ionia.
Book 10 of the Iliad.
Book 10 of the Iliad, which details a night raid, is almost certainly a later insertion by a different poet, added to the main text well after its initial composition. It just breaks the narrative flow and is stylistically distinct.
That's fascinating, a 4,000-year-old game of spot the forgery.
Yeah.
Now, since we can't rely on biography, we have to rely entirely on linguistic and historical clues for dating. And the scholarly estimates here vary wildly.
They really do. They range from the late 9th century BC deep into the 7th century BC. On the early end, you have scholars like Richard Jenko, who propose an 8th century BC date based on linguistic statistics.
And this aligns with the ancient historian Herodotus' claim that Homer lived 400 years before his time.
It does.
What material clues support this early dating?
Well, Barry B. Powell, who supports an early 8th century date, say 800, 750 BC, argues based on absence.
What's missing?
The poems conspicuously lack mention of certain Iron Age military and social practices. For example, there is no mention of hoplite tactics.
And for context, hoplite tactics were the signature military development of the later Iron Age. Massed infantry formations, shield lock to shield, where the individual heroics of the Mycenaean age gave way to collective discipline.
Exactly. The fact that the Homeric heroes fight individually, using chariot transport rather than massed infantry, suggests the core tradition predates the development of these revolutionary tactics. Powell also notes the absence of mentions of widespread literacy.
But others argue for a much later composition date, suggesting the text was finalized much deeper into the Iron Age.
Martin Litchfield West is a key figure here. He suggests a later dating for the Iliad, perhaps 660–650 BC, with the Odyssey composed a generation later.
And his reasoning.
West points to sophisticated structural elements and potential echoes of Hesiod's slightly later poetry. More controversially, he suggests the poet demonstrates knowledge of major historical events that occurred in the mid-7th century BC.
Such as what?
West argues the poet may have known about the destruction of Babylon in 689 BC by the Assyrian king Sennacherib and possibly the sack of Thebes in 664–663 BC. If that's true, it pushes the composition of the final written version much closer to the age of the Athenian tyrants.
And then there's the view that Homer wasn't a static point in time at all.
Right, that the tradition was continually dynamic.
Who advocates for that?
That's the view advocated by Gregory Nagy. He proposes that Homer was not a fixed author, but a continually evolving tradition. It certainly began stabilizing when it was first written down, but Nagy suggests the tradition of performance and modification continued, though gradually diminishing, until as late as the middle of the 2nd century BC.
Right, when the Alexandrian scholars formalized the text.
Exactly. This perspective transforms Homer from a single man into a vast cultural performance that took hundreds of years to complete.
So, whether the poems were finalized in the 8th or 7th century BC, the fact remains that they were the product of a living, evolving oral tradition. This means the poet or poets had an incredibly specific, technical, and sophisticated toolkit built purely for live performance.
This is literary engineering at its finest.
Let's get into that toolkit.
The language itself is the first tool, the Kunstsprache. We've touched on it, but it's a purposeful amalgam of dialects, Ionic being the base, but it's tailored specifically for one purpose: epic hexameter poetry.
It's an artificial language that serves the meter perfectly.
It does.
And the meter, dactylic hexameter, is the rhythmic backbone. For the listener, what exactly does that mean? How does it sound?
Dactylic hexameter is a quantity-based meter, not a stress-based meter like most English poetry. A dactyl is a metrical foot of one long syllable followed by two short syllables. Think of a drum beat. Long, short, short. Exactly. The poet uses 6 of these feet per line. The structure is unvarying, which is incredibly demanding.
And this demanding structure necessitates the specific oral devices that Parry and Lord identified.
Right, the things that allow the bard to fill the line instantly.
And this is where we get the famous epithets, the set phrases.
Exactly. These phrases like crafty Odysseus, rosy-fingered dawn, or cloud-gatherer Zeus are pre-packaged linguistic units of specific lengths. They aren't ornamental filler.
No, they're metric building blocks.
Right. They allow the poet to summon a character or object while ensuring the line retains its perfect rhythm.
Beyond just the epithets, you have the Homeric formulae, entire repeated lines or half-lines that signal transitions or recurring actions.
These formulae are critical time savers during improvisation. Think of lines like, "And then answered him Agamemnon, king of men," or "When the early-born rose-fingered dawn came to light."
They're instantly deployable.
And they're essential for keeping the performance flowing rapidly without taxing the memory or compromising the meter.
And syntactically, the poet uses parataxis, which is actually a simpler structure than we might expect from later literate poets.
That's right. Unlike Virgil or Milton, who use these massive, complex sentences with multiple subordinate clauses, hypotaxis Homer employs parataxis.
An additive cumulative style.
Yes. Main words are generally placed toward the beginning of the sentence, followed by subsequent simpler clauses that expand on the idea. This is far easier for a performing poet to manage.
Why is that?
Because they don't have to hold a complicated interlocking grammatical structure in their memory while they improvise the main narrative thread.
It speeds up the live composition dramatically. It's a structure that supports memory. Speaking of memory, the type scene is another powerful mnemonic device.
Type scenes, identified by Walter Ernd in 1933, are essentially blocks of set phrases or conventional descriptions used for frequently recurring activities.
So every time a hero eats a meal, or puts on his armor,
or prays, or sacrifices an animal, the bard deploys a pre-established sequence of events and phrases.
So the bard isn't inventing the menu every time Odysseus sits down to eat.
No. They are deploying the established eating sequence, which they can then elaborate upon or shorten as the meter requires.
It creates a sense of stability and familiarity for the audience.
And critically, it saves the poet's cognitive load for the unique dramatic elements of the story, like the dialogue or the specific combat action.
And finally, there is the subtle architecture of ring composition.
This is a beautiful structural device, also known as chiastic structure. The poet begins a section with an idea or theme, A, develops through points B and C, and then concludes the section by returning to C, B, and A, framing the entire episode.
Like bookends.
Exactly. For instance, a speech might begin and end with the same address to the gods. There is a scholarly debate over whether this is a conscious, high artistic device or primarily a powerful mnemonic loop.
A loop that signals to the performing poet when an episode is complete.
And also aids the audience's memory.
Regardless, the fact that these poems, built on improvisation, exhibit such sophisticated architecture proves they were not clumsy compilations.
No, they were works of immense artistic skill, honed over generations.
And they adhere to tradition right from the very start with the invocation.
Yes, both epics begin with a prayer to the muse, asking for the inspiration and the memory needed to tell the story.
The Iliad asks her to sing of the anger of Achilles.
And the Odyssey asks her to tell of the man of many ways. It's an instant declaration of the poem's high purpose and its reliance on divine guidance.
So when we move from the poet's toolkit to the world they describe, we enter a kind of blended historical reality. The historicity debate remains fierce. Did the Trojan War actually happen?
Well, the 19th century discovery by Heinrich Schliemann of the ruins at Hisarlik in modern Turkey, identified as the likely site of Troy, certainly lent huge credence to the myth.
And scholars today often link the myth to a real historical event.
Yes, to the historical destruction of Troyavia around 1220 BC, an event that would have remained in the collective memory of the succeeding Greek generations.
But regardless of whether a single historical event inspired the core, scholars agree that the Homeric poems depict an anachronistic society.
It's a blending of customs and material elements derived from radically different periods of Greek history.
Specifically, the Mycenaean Bronze Age and the later Iron Age when the poems are being sung.
It's a historical collage, yes. For Bronze Age elements, the heroes consistently use bronze weapons, fitting the Mycenaean period in which the poem is set.
And there are other more specific details.
Extremely specific details that confirm ancient memory, like the description of the helmet Odysseus wears, which is made of boar's tusks. Such helmets were characteristic, aristocratic Mycenaean pieces, commonly worn between 1600 and 1150 BC.
Long before the poems were committed to writing.
And the heroes also used the huge, body-sized shields typical of Mycenaean warriors.
But the Iron Age, the age of the bard, creeps in and updates those details.
It does. The same heroes who fight with bronze swords are often cremated, their bodies burned, which was the standard funerary practice of the Iron Age Greeks.
Whereas burial, or inhumation, was the Bronze Age custom.
Correct. The poet also occasionally references heroes using smaller, round shields, which became common in the early Iron Age when the oral tradition was reaching its peak.
This confirms that the bards were inheriting material from a much older, more glamorous era, but they were unconsciously updating some practices to suit the contemporary understanding of their audience.
It's a living tradition that reflects both the past and the present.
And we have to remember that these are works of art, not historical documentation.
Absolutely. There are fictional elements interwoven. A famous example from the Iliad is the detailed description near Troy of two unique springs, one steaming hot and one icy cold located near where Hector makes his final tragic stand against Achilles.
And archaeologists have looked for this.
They've searched the site of Hisarlik thoroughly, and they have found no evidence that springs of that specific, unique description ever existed.
So that detail was inserted purely for dramatic, poetic effect.
Yes, to ground the climax of the duel in a memorable, almost supernatural landscape.
Okay, so we have these vast, sophisticated, evolving oral poems. The final step is understanding the massive logistical feat of getting them out of the memory of a bard and onto a scroll.
We know the core process. The orally transmitted poems were put into a stable written form at some point between the 8th and 6th centuries BC.
And the shift from oral to written is often argued to have occurred via dictation.
Dictation theory suggests the current massive versions originated as texts dictated by the primary bard who held the entire tradition in his memory to a scribe.
And critically, Albert Lord's studies of Balkan bards showed something interesting about that process.
They did. He showed that these poets often revised and expanded their songs during the process of dictation, knowing they were creating a permanent, fixed version.
So the act of writing them down may have been the moment of their final grand monumental expansion.
Indeed, it was a stabilization process. This brings us to the famous ancient belief regarding the final collection and organization, the Pisistratian recension.
Explain the significance of Pisistratus here.
Pisistratus was a tyrant, a ruler of Athens in the late 6th century BC, known for being a great patron of the arts. The widely held ancient belief, referenced by figures like Cicero, was that Pisistratus was responsible for collecting the long, sprawling oral tradition and having it organized into a single, cohesive written format.
An essential step to transitioning the poem from a flexible oral script into a fixed literary text.
And once it was textualized and organized in Athens, the text needed to be standardized. That task fell to the scholars of the Hellenistic world.
Primarily in Alexandria, centuries later.
Yes, this is where the poems were given the formal structure we recognize today. They were each divided into 24 sections, or rhapsodes, which we now call books, and labeled with the letters of the Greek alphabet.
And this division and standardization is mostly attributed to the Hellenistic scholars in Alexandria.
People like Xenodotus of Ephesus, Aristophanes of Byzantium, and the most influential of them all, Aristarchus of Samothrace.
It was these scholars, working around 150 BC, who helped establish the canonical, relatively stable text based on existing papyrus fragments. They established a textual baseline that modern scholarship still refers to.
And it's fascinating that today, modern textual scholarship often works with medieval manuscripts and existing papyri, often arguing for a multi-text view.
What does that mean, a multi-text view?
It means scholars acknowledge that we may never find a single definitive original text. Instead, they study how the text changed across different traditions, looking at major editions like those of Lidwich, who closely followed Aristarchus, or Van Til, who followed the medieval Vulgate.
So it underscores that even in its fixed state, the text carries a history of its layered, evolving origins.
The text itself is a record of its own composition.
It's an incredible journey from an improvised song in the 8th century BC to Eustathius's 6,000 pages of commentary in the 12th century AD.
We've journeyed from the bloody ground of Troy through the fictional biographies, the analytical dissection of the poems, and the revolutionary findings of the oral bards in the Balkans.
The central learning for you, our listener, is that Homer is less a singular man and more a vast shifting cultural tradition.
It is, yes.
A tradition that encompasses the history of warfare, layers of myth, sophisticated poetic engineering, the formulas, type scenes, and ring composition, and, critically, centuries of rigorous academic questioning that constantly redefine the identity of the author.
Indeed. We know the figure of Homer survived the intense scrutiny of the analysts, and even when scholars agreed that the poems weren't composed in one sitting by one man, they still recognize the power, the unity, and the brilliant artistic design of the works that were eventually assembled.
We established that the Iliad and Odyssey likely had different primary authors, that the text evolved over hundreds of years, was edited, and wasn't truly finalized until centuries after it was initially sung.
And yet the name Homer persists.
It does.
So here's the final provocative thought for you to chew on. If the figure known as Homer, whose individual identity remains a mystery, taught Greece and inspired every great poet who followed,
and yet we accept that his masterpiece was likely composed by different primary authors and shaped by successive generations of bards, scribes, and even political patrons like Pisistratus.
should we view Homer not as a single genius poet, but as a collective, powerful literary process?
What does it mean for the foundation of Western literature to be simultaneously attributed to one solitary genius and assembled by a succession of thousands of voices across centuries?
It means the poem is bigger than any single poet.
And that the deep dive continues. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.
We'll see you next time.